the world has moved on, but Alberta Health and Alberta Justice are still prosecuting. And they haven't had a lot of wins, but they've had a few.
Yeah.
And it just feels like a hangover from a bygone era.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's in sync with the times. Is there a way to move on? It feels like a vendetta from some prosecutors that really want to punish these guys. That's how, now I'm coming from a very strong point of view. I support these guys.
Yeah.
And I know you've got to be, you can't meddle in a judicial process, but boy, it doesn't feel like it's in the public interest.
I think we learned a lot about how our justice system works in watching things at the federal level, and how the Attorney General and the Crown have an independence from the Premier's office. The questions that I can ask and have asked and continue to ask is it in the public interest?
Yeah.
And is there a reasonable likelihood of conviction?
Yeah.
And I think the longer that we go on seeing that prosecutions are not being successful, it makes a stronger case on both of those fronts. That if the conviction isn't likely, we know that we have a lot of pressure on our courts.
Yeah.
And if the public has now come to terms with wanting a different approach, is it in the public interest? It's becoming increasingly hard to answer those two questions. Now, I put it to the prosecutors, and I've asked them to do a review of the cases with those two things in mind, and I'm hopeful that we'll see a true turning of the page, because I think you're very right that something changed in February when the Freedom Convoy took place. That I think people realize that now we know more about this virus, we have more effective means to be able to address it, that some of the extreme measures that may have had a lot of widespread support early on, they just don't have the same widespread support today. And so do you continue on in prosecuting when the public has moved on? That's the big question that the Crown has got to come to terms with. That's
really how marijuana decriminalization happened. It did happen legislatively, but for years, prosecutors just did not prosecute small possession of marijuana, even though it was against the law. There are 3 truckers from Lethbridge, not violent, no firearms. One of them was a town councillor in Fort Macleod. They're being prosecuted. The prosecutor wants 10 years in prison. This is at the Coots blockade. Yeah. And I'm glad you're looking into that. And Yeah. My next question is partly a lockdown prosecution, but it actually makes me think about oil and gas, because that same pastor, Pawlowski, is on trial in February for violating the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. I don't think it's going to succeed, but that law was designed to fight eco-terrorism, designed to fight anti-oil patch activists. It's never been used for that purpose. What is the state of play in the globally funded, globally directed war against Alberta's oil sands? Because oil has never been more in demand from Russia, from OPEC. Natural gas has never been more in demand. This war in Ukraine proves that. Yeah. But we still don't have access to blue water.
Yeah. I would say that there is, again, we're in the middle of, I think, a reassessment. We have to be, because people are now seeing a spike in their gasoline and diesel bills. We're seeing electricity go up. We're seeing home heating go up. We're seeing the cost of everything go up. And consumers, especially those who are low income, on fixed incomes, they're really hurting. So I think that that's creating a bit of a wake-up call for politicians that affordability is number one. We know here we've had to make a number of measures to try to address some of that affordability crisis. Energy security too. This is the interesting thing I'm seeing in the U.S. as well, is that those on the Democrat side are concerned about affordability. Those on the Republican side are worried about energy security. And they're all looking up to Canada and saying, maybe that's one of the answers. We sent Sonia Savage to COP27 because, quite frankly, I just don't think the federal government does a very good job of representing our views.
That's the Global Warming Summit?
Correct. And we had John Kerry ask the Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, what are you doing up in Alberta? What are you doing up in Canada? You guys are miles ahead of us on environmental issues. And so if we are the very best in the environment, the very best in energy security, and also able to provide affordability, that seems to me to be a way of restarting the conversation. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have a bit of a breakthrough with our American friends, because I think that that's very influential on Justin Trudeau. I'm getting a sense as well that there's some pragmatism at the federal level with Champagne and Chrystia Freeland and Jonathan Wilkinson. I think perhaps they recognize just how much Alberta contributes to federal coffers. I mean, we're only, 10% of the population, contributing 16% of GDP. That has an impact on federal revenues. And if there's a way for us to be able to achieve all those targets, we should be working together rather than fighting. I still think we have an incredibly ideological environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault. And he's going to be a constant challenge for us. It's part of the reason why we put up the shield of the Sovereignty Act, is that during our leadership race, he started floating ideas like a 30% emissions reduction on fertilizer and a 42% emissions reduction on oil and natural gas, but before we'd even put a new premier in place. So I think the federal government was taking us for granted, just thinking that they could pass laws and that we would just sit back and then hopefully spend years fighting it through court. But we can't do that anymore. This is just too crucial. So I don't know that we've seen necessarily a complete change, but I was encouraged by the fact that Guilbeault did not sign on to the final agreement at COP27 because he recognized it wanted to talk about a phase out of oil and natural gas. He recognized that's provincial jurisdiction and that he would face a legal challenge from the provinces that he would not win. So maybe we're having a bit of a breakthrough, and I'm delighted to see that Scott Moe is going down the same track as we are with the Saskatchewan First Act. I think this is the kind of conversation we need to have.